What if the day you felt weakest became the day that quietly changed your life? In this story, I share what happened inside an American hospital, where fear, slow conversations, and simple kindness helped me keep going. Through this real moment, you'll practice easy English listening and speaking while discovering how one difficult day turned into hope. A difficult day at the hospital. What if the day you felt weakest became the day that quietly changed your life forever? Imagine walking into an American hospital with a heavy heart, a tired body, and one more problem that no doctor could easily fix: your English. Not terrible English. Not zero English. But that awkward, slow, careful English that makes every sentence feel like crossing a busy street with your eyes half closed. That was exactly where I found myself one cold morning in the United States. The sky outside the hospital looked pale and quiet, the kind of sky that makes everything feel slower. I remember standing near the entrance, holding the glass door for a second longer than necessary. Not because it was heavy, because I was nervous. My body didn't feel well, but my mind was even more uncomfortable. You see, when you are sick in your own country, you only worry about your health. But when you are sick in another country, especially a place where people speak fast, confident English, you worry about something else too. Understanding. Or worse, not understanding. Inside the hospital lobby, everything felt clean, bright, and strangely calm. Nurses walked quickly, but quietly. Machines beeped softly in the distance. A television near the waiting area showed morning news, but the words moved too fast for my tired brain. I walked to the reception desk. The woman behind the desk smiled politely. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Simple sentence. Very normal sentence. The kind of sentence English learners hear thousands of times. But when you're nervous, even simple sentences feel like puzzles. For 1 second, my brain froze. It was like opening a drawer in your mind and finding everything inside suddenly mixed up. I took a small breath. "Hello. I need to see doctor," I said slowly. Not perfect grammar, but clear enough. She nodded kindly. "Of course. Are you feeling pain today?"
Pain.
That word was easy.
Good.
My brain relaxed a little. Yes, the little pain. And very tired. She handed me a clipboard with several forms. Names, address, insurance, medical history. Many words. Many boxes. Now here's something funny about learning English that nobody tells you. Your brain behaves very differently when you study at home compared to when you stand in a real situation. At home, you might read English slowly, comfortably, maybe with coffee nearby. Your brain says, yes, I know this word. But inside a hospital, when your heart beats faster and your body feels weak, your brain suddenly becomes dramatic. It acts like a stressed actor in a bad movie. What is this word again? Wait, what does this sentence mean? Why are there so many forms? Psychologists actually have a simple explanation for this. When humans feel stress, the brain focuses on survival, not language learning. The emotional part of the brain, called the amygdala, becomes very active. And when that happens, your logical thinking slows down. In simple words, stress makes English feel harder. And at that moment, I was definitely stressed. Still, I started filling out the form slowly.
Name.
Address. Date of birth. Those were easy. Then I reached a question that stopped me. Describe your symptoms. Symptoms. I knew the word, but suddenly my brain refused to cooperate.
Pain? Tired? Weak? Dizzy?
How do you explain that clearly? I looked around the waiting room. A few people sat quietly reading their phones.
An elderly man coughed softly.
A child played with a small toy car on the floor. And for a moment, I had a strange thought. Maybe many English learners have experienced this exact feeling. Not inside a hospital, but in daily life. At a job interview. At a government office. At a school meeting. At a phone call with customer service. You know some English, but not enough to feel powerful. And that small gap between knowing and speaking can feel like a wall. I wrote slowly on the form. Tired. Headache. Sometimes dizzy. Simple words. Short sentences. But honest. After a few minutes, the receptionist called my name. Hearing your name spoken in an American accent always feels interesting. Slightly different. Slightly unfamiliar. I stood up and followed a hallway with white walls and soft lights. Hospitals in America have a particular smell. Not unpleasant, just very clean. Like soap and quiet. Soon I entered a small examination room.
A chair. A bed.
A computer. Medical tools on the wall. And then something happened that I did not expect. A nurse walked in. She looked at me, smiled warmly, and spoke. But not fast.
Slow.
Very slow. Hello. My name is Sarah. I will help you today. Each word was clear.
Calm.
Gentle. For the first time that morning, I felt my shoulders relax. She continued. If anything is difficult to understand, please tell me. We can go slowly. Now that sentence may sound small to you, but at that moment it felt incredibly kind. Because language learners don't always need perfect grammar lessons. Sometimes they only need patience. Real patience. And in that quiet hospital room, something unexpected began to happen. Not just medical care. Conversation. Real English conversation. Simple. Slow. Human. And, strangely enough, that ordinary morning in an American hospital was about to teach me something far more powerful than vocabulary lists or grammar books. Something about kindness, about communication, and about the surprising way life sometimes teaches you English when you least expect it. But the next thing the nurse asked me completely changed the direction of that day. And I promise you, it was not a medical question. The fear of not understanding English. The nurse looked at me gently, holding a small tablet in her hands. Her voice was calm, slower than most people I had heard in America. For a moment, I thought the difficult part was over. I was inside the hospital room, sitting on the chair, breathing normally again. Then she asked a simple question. So, how long have you been feeling this way? That question should have been easy. But something strange happened inside my brain. My mind suddenly started racing through possibilities. Did she mean the headache? The tired feeling? Or the dizziness? Did she want the number of days? Weeks? Months? This is one of the quiet challenges of learning English that many people never talk about. The problem is not always vocabulary. Sometimes it's interpretation. When someone asks a question, your brain must quickly choose the correct meaning from many possible meanings. For native speakers, this happens automatically, like breathing. For language learners, it can feel like solving a puzzle in 5 seconds. I blinked once, thinking carefully. Maybe 2 weeks, I said slowly. The nurse nodded and typed something into her tablet. Okay. And the dizziness, does it happen every day or only sometimes? Again, the question seemed simple, but another small storm began inside my mind. Every day, sometimes, often, occasionally, English has many words that look similar but feel slightly different. And when you're tired, your brain starts behaving like a confused tourist holding a map upside down. I think sometimes, I answered. She smiled. That's helpful. Thank you. Now, something interesting happened in that moment. My body relaxed a little more. Not because my English suddenly improved, but because the nurse did something very important. She listened patiently. She did not interrupt. She did not rush. Psychologists actually have a simple explanation for why that matters. When people feel judged or rushed during conversation, the brain releases stress hormones like cortisol. These hormones make thinking slower and memory weaker. In other words, pressure makes language harder. But kindness does the opposite. Kindness tells the brain, you're safe. And when the brain feels safe, it starts working better again. The nurse continued asking gentle questions. Are you sleeping well? Do you drink enough water? Have you been working a lot recently? Little by little, the conversation began to flow more naturally. I noticed something surprising. When people speak slowly and clearly, your listening ability improves immediately. It's almost like turning down the speed of a movie so you can finally see every detail. That's why many language teachers recommend listening practice at slower speeds. Studies from language learning research show that learners understand new vocabulary much better when speech is slightly slower than normal. And that's exactly what was happening in this hospital room. Real English, but slow enough to understand. Still, even with the nurse's kindness, a small fear remained inside me. What if the doctor comes in and speaks very fast? Doctors in movies always talk quickly. Long medical words. Complicated explanations. I imagine myself sitting there nodding politely, pretending to understand everything. Have you ever done that? Someone speaks English quickly, and you smile and nod while your brain quietly whispers, I understood maybe 20%. It happens to almost every English learner at some point. Your brain tries to protect your confidence. So instead of saying, sorry, could you repeat that? You simply pretend. But pretending has a cost. You leave the conversation confused. And confusion slowly grows into fear. Sitting in that quiet hospital room, I realized something uncomfortable. This fear had followed me for a long time. At the grocery store, at work meetings, at phone calls, even when ordering food. Not a big fear, just a small shadow that whispered, maybe your English isn't good enough. The nurse must have noticed the thoughtful look on my face. She paused typing and looked at me. Are you feeling okay right now? She asked gently. I laughed a little. Yes, just thinking. About what? She asked. For a moment I hesitated. Should I say it? Then I decided to be honest. Sometimes English is difficult for me, I admitted. I worry I don't understand everything. She nodded slowly, as if she had heard this many times before. You know, she said, leaning slightly against the counter, many patients feel that way. Even people who speak English their whole life. That surprised me. Really? She smiled. Medical English can be confusing for anyone. Then she said something that stayed in my memory for years. Communication is not about perfect English. It's about understanding each other. Simple sentence, but powerful. Suddenly the room felt lighter. My English didn't change in that moment. My vocabulary didn't magically grow. But my fear became smaller. Sometimes learning a language is not about adding more words. Sometimes it's about removing the fear that blocks the words you already know. The nurse finished entering notes into her tablet. "The doctor will come in a few minutes," she said. And just like that, my heart started beating faster again. Because now the real test was coming. Doctors are busy. Doctors speak quickly. Doctors use long medical words that sound like they belong in science textbooks. I imagined the door opening. A fast conversation. A confused patient.
Me.
But something unexpected was about to happen next. Something that would completely change the way I thought about English and about people. Because the person who was about to walk through that hospital door would not only help with my health. That moment would quietly begin a chain of events that would change my life in America in ways I never imagined. And strangely enough, it all started with one very unusual question. Not about medicine, not about symptoms, but about my life. And when the doctor finally stepped into the room, the first sentence he said made me freeze for a completely different reason. A kind nurse changed everything. The door opened softly. For half a second, my brain prepared for the typical movie scene. A busy doctor walking in quickly, speaking fast English. Using complicated medical words that sound like they belong in a university lecture. But that is not what happened. Instead, the same nurse stepped back into the room.
Sarah.
She held a small blood pressure monitor in her hand and smiled the same calm smile as before. "Before the doctor comes, I'll check a few things," she said gently. Something about her voice had a very unusual effect. It slowed down the entire room. The machines, the lights, even my thoughts seemed calmer. "Please relax your arm here," she said. I placed my arm on the table while she wrapped the cuff around it. The machine started making soft pumping sounds. Hospitals often feel like places full of technology, machines, numbers, screens, but in that moment, the most powerful thing in the room was not a machine. It was patience. Sarah looked at the monitor and nodded. "Your blood pressure is a little high today. That can happen when people feel stressed." I laughed quietly. Yes, maybe I am a little stressed. She raised her eyebrows playfully. Hospital visits can do that. Then she did something unexpected. Instead of immediately moving to the next medical question, she pulled a small chair closer and sat down. Now that might sound like a tiny action, but in busy places like hospitals, sitting down with a patient is surprisingly rare. Most medical staff stand, ask questions quickly, and move to the next room. But Sarah sat down like she had time. And that changed everything. "You mentioned earlier that English is sometimes difficult for you," she said. "Where are you originally from?" That question instantly felt easier than medical vocabulary. I told her about my country, about moving to the United States, about trying to build a life here while learning English slowly. She listened carefully, nodding. "Moving to another country takes a lot of courage," she said. Now here is something interesting about the human brain. Neuroscientists have discovered that when people feel respected and heard, the brain releases a chemical called oxytocin. Oxytocin helps reduce stress and increase trust. In simple words, Kindness changes how the brain works. And that's exactly what I felt in that moment. The fear that had been sitting quietly in my chest since the morning started to shrink. Sarah asked another simple question. How long have you been studying English? About 3 years, I said. 3 years is a good start, she replied. I laughed again. Sometimes it doesn't feel like a good start. She tilted her head.
Why?
And that's when something honest came out my mouth before I could stop it. Because sometimes I still feel like a beginner. She nodded slowly, as if she completely understood. Language learning is strange, she said. Progress often feels invisible. That sentence caught my attention. Invisible progress. She explained further. When people exercise, they can see muscles growing. When people study math, they see better test scores. But language learning happens quietly inside the brain. Many improvements happen before you notice them. She pointed gently toward my clipboard on the table. Earlier today, you explained your symptoms clearly. That's real communication. I looked down at the form. Tired. Headache. Sometimes dizzy. 3 small sentences. But she was right. They worked. Communication happened. Psychologists who study language learning call this something very interesting. Functional language use. It means using the language you already know to achieve a real goal, even if the grammar is not perfect. And research shows something surprising. People who practice real conversations, even simple ones, often improve faster than people who only study grammar books. Because the brain learns best through meaningful experiences, like conversations in unexpected places, like hospital rooms. Sarah stood up and checked the monitor again. Your heart rate is calming down, she said. That's good news, I replied. She smiled. Maybe talking helps. Then she added something playful. Or maybe my slow English is helping. We both laughed. But she was actually right. When English is spoken slowly and clearly, learners can process the sounds more easily. The brain has more time to connect words with meaning. Many language researchers call this comprehensible input, language that is just slightly above your current level, but still understandable. And that morning, Sarah was giving me exactly that. Real English.
Clear English.
Human English. Suddenly, the hospital didn't feel like a stressful place anymore. It felt like an unexpected classroom, except there were no textbooks.
No grammar exercises.
Just conversation. And kindness. Then Sarah glanced at the door. The doctor should be here soon, she said. My stomach tightened again. Is he very fast when speaking? I asked carefully. She laughed softly. Dr. Miller? Sometimes. My heart sank a little. But then she added something that surprised me. Don't worry. I'll stay in the room. You will? I asked. Of course, she said. If anything is unclear, we can explain it together. That sentence felt like someone had quietly turned on a light in a dark room. Learning English alone can feel scary. But learning English with someone supportive feels completely different. The nurse moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and one more thing, she said. What? I asked. Dr. Miller loves talking to people from different countries. That sounded interesting.
Why?
She smiled mysteriously. You'll see. And right at that moment, the door handle slowly turned. Footsteps approached. The doctor was about to walk in. But what he said in the first 10 seconds would surprise me more than anything else that morning. Because instead of starting with medical questions, he asked something that had nothing to do with hospitals. Something about my life. Something about love. And that strange question would quietly start a story I never expected to begin inside a hospital room. Small conversations that helped me learn. The door opened slowly. A tall man wearing a white coat stepped inside, holding a tablet in one hand and a warm, relaxed expression on his face. His name badge read Dr. Miller. He looked exactly like what most people imagine when they think of an American doctor, professional, calm, and quietly confident. But the first thing he said was not what I expected. He didn't start with medical questions. He didn't say, "Where does it hurt?" or "Tell me about your symptoms." Instead, he looked at me, smiled, and asked a question that made my brain pause. "So, what brought you to the United States?" For a second, I thought I misunderstood. My brain quickly replayed the sentence. "What brought you to the United States?" That was not a medical question. That was a life question. I glanced at Sarah, the nurse, who was standing near the computer. She gave a small, encouraging nod, as if to say, "Go ahead." I took a slow breath. "Well, I came here for a better life," I said carefully. Dr. Miller leaned lightly against the counter, clearly not in a hurry. "A better life," he repeated. "That's a powerful reason." Then he added something interesting. "America is full of people who came for that exact reason." Now, here's something fascinating about conversations in real life. They rarely move in straight lines. In language textbooks, dialogues are simple and organized. "Hello. How are you?" "I am fine." But real conversations behave more like rivers. They curve, pause, and sometimes go in unexpected directions. And that's exactly what happened in that hospital room. Dr. Miller finally looked at the medical notes on his tablet. "Headache, tired, occasional dizziness," he read slowly. Then he looked up again. "Have you been working a lot recently?" I nodded. "Yes." "And also studying English?" He smiled. Studying English. That explains something." I blinked. "What?" "Your sentences are careful," he said. "That's usually a sign someone is thinking very hard about grammar." Sarah laughed quietly. "That's true," she added. Now, something funny happened in my brain at that moment. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I actually felt relieved. Because the doctor noticed my English effort, not as a problem, but as something understandable. This is another interesting discovery from psychology. When people feel accepted during communication, they become more willing to speak. Researchers call this lowering the affective filter. In simple terms, when you stop worrying about making mistakes, your brain speaks more freely. And suddenly I felt like talking. "Yes," I admitted. "Sometimes I think too much before speaking." Dr. Miller nodded thoughtfully. That happens to many language learners. Then he asked another unexpected question. "How do you usually practice English?" That question opened a small door in the conversation. I explained that I watched videos, listened to slow English podcasts, and sometimes tried to read simple stories. "Stories are excellent," he said immediately. "Why?" I asked. "Because stories train the brain differently," he explained. "When we hear stories, the brain connects language with emotions and images. That makes words easier to remember. Sarah added, "It's like watching a movie in your mind." And they were right. Think about the last movie you watched. You probably remember the story clearly, even the dialogue, because your brain connected language with feelings and images. That's why learning English through stories works so well. And strangely enough, I realized something in that moment. I was already inside a story. Not a movie, not a book. A real-life story inside an American hospital room. Dr. Miller turned the tablet slightly so I could see the screen. "Let's talk about your symptoms," he said. Finally, the medical conversation began. But something was different now. Because instead of fast, technical language, he spoke slowly and clearly. "When does the headache usually start?" he asked. "In the morning," I replied. "And the dizziness?" "Sometimes when I stand up quickly." He nodded and typed a few notes. Then he explained something interesting. When people work a lot and sleep poorly, the body can become very tired. The brain also becomes tired. He tapped the side of his head lightly. And when the brain is tired, concentration becomes difficult. That includes concentrating on language. That explanation felt strangely comforting. Maybe my English problems that morning were not only about language. Maybe they were also about exhaustion. Dr. Miller continued asking a few more questions while Sarah checked my temperature. The conversation moved naturally between medical topics and small pieces of life. Where do you live? What kind of work do you do? How long have you been in America? Each answer felt easier than the last, because something important had happened earlier. The fear of speaking English had begun to fade. Not completely, but enough to allow real conversation. Then Dr. Miller finished typing and looked up again. "Good news," he said. "What?" I asked. "I don't see any signs of serious illness." I felt immediate relief. "Most likely your body is simply tired and stressed," he continued. Then he added something unexpected. "But I'm more interested in something else." My curiosity returned instantly. "What?" He smiled slightly. "You came to America for a better life. That's a big journey." He paused for a moment, studying my expression. "Are you happy here?" That question felt deeper than any medical question, because happiness is not easy to answer, especially in another language. And before I could respond, Sarah suddenly said something that changed the entire direction of the conversation. Something that would lead to a story I never expected. Something about a volunteer program at the hospital. A program where people from different cultures shared stories, helped patients, and practiced English together. And strangely enough, that small idea, mentioned casually in a hospital room, would soon lead me to meet someone who would change my life completely. But at that moment, I had no idea. All I knew was that the nurse was smiling, the doctor was curious, and a new possibility was quietly appearing in front of me. A possibility that had nothing to do with medicine, and everything to do with language, kindness, and a story that was just beginning. Cultural differences in American hospitals. Sarah leaned slightly against the counter, her arms folded comfortably, as if she was remembering something interesting. "You know," she said, looking at Dr. Miller and then back at me, "our hospital has a small volunteer program." Dr. Miller nodded. "That's true. It's one of the best parts of this place." I tilted my head slightly. "A volunteer program?" Sarah smiled. "Yes. People from the community come here to talk with patients, help them feel less lonely, and sometimes share stories about their lives. She paused for a moment, and many of them are immigrants learning English. Now that sentence immediately caught my attention. Immigrants learning English inside a hospital? That sounds interesting, I said carefully. It is, Dr. Miller replied. Hospitals can feel very lonely for patients. Sometimes conversation is just as important as medicine. Now here is something fascinating about culture that many people don't notice until they move to another country. Different cultures treat hospitals very differently. In some countries, hospitals are purely medical spaces. You go there, see the doctor, receive treatment, and leave as quickly as possible. But in many hospitals in the United States, something else exists alongside the medical care. Emotional care, volunteers, counselors, social workers. People whose job is not to fix the body, but to support the human experience of being sick. And that idea felt surprisingly beautiful to me. Sarah noticed my curiosity. We even have volunteers who just sit with patients and talk, she explained. Some patients are here for many days. Conversation helps them feel less alone, Dr. Miller added, and it helps volunteers too.
How?
I asked. Because listening to other people's stories reminds you how connected we all are. That idea stayed in my mind for a moment. Connected. Different languages, different countries, different lives, yet somehow connected. I thought about the morning again. When I walked into the hospital, I felt like a stranger. Someone who didn't fully belong. Someone whose English still felt fragile. But now the room felt different. It felt welcoming. Sarah walked over to a small cabinet and grabbed a brochure. She handed it to me. This explains the volunteer program, she said. I looked down at the paper. The English was simple, but my brain still moved slowly through the sentences. Community conversation, volunteers, support for patients, cultural exchange. The words felt warm, and something interesting happened in my mind. For the first time since moving to America, I imagined using my English not just to survive, but to connect. That is a very important shift in language learning. Many people start learning a language because they must. For work, for paperwork, for survival. But when language becomes a tool for connection, the motivation changes completely. Psychologists call this intrinsic motivation, when you do something because it feels meaningful, not because you are forced. And intrinsic motivation is incredibly powerful. People who feel emotionally connected to language learning often improve faster and stay motivated longer. But at that moment, I still felt unsure. Do volunteers need perfect English? I asked cautiously. Sarah laughed softly. No one needs perfect English. Dr. Miller nodded. Perfect English doesn't exist, he said. Even native speakers make mistakes every day. That statement surprised me. But many people speak very fast, I said. Dr. Miller smiled. Fast English is not always good communication. That sentence felt strangely comforting. He continued. Good communication means making sure the other person understands you. Sometimes that means speaking slower, choosing simpler words, and paying attention. In other words, exactly what Sarah had been doing since the beginning of the morning. And suddenly I realized something important. The kindness I experienced in that hospital room was not an accident. It was part of the culture. American healthcare, often talks about something called patient-centered care. The idea is simple but powerful. Treat the patient as a whole person, not just a medical problem. That means listening, explaining clearly, showing empathy, and sometimes simply sitting down and talking. Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall. "Well," she said, "the doctor will finish the medical part now." Dr. Miller turned his attention back to the tablet. "We'll run a simple blood test today," he explained slowly, "just to make sure everything looks normal." I nodded. "That's okay." "It will only take a few minutes," he said. But before leaving the room, he paused. Then he looked at me thoughtfully. "You mentioned earlier that you're studying English through stories," he said. "Yes." "Stories are powerful," he continued. "They help people remember language." He tapped the brochure lightly. "You might enjoy listening to stories here too." Sarah added with a playful smile, "Some volunteers even become very good friends with the patients they meet." Friends. That word felt interesting. Friendship in a hospital. Unexpected, but somehow comforting. I placed the brochure on the table and leaned back in the chair. A strange thought crossed my mind. What if the hospital visit that started with fear slowly became the beginning of something new? Something bigger than a medical checkup. Something involving conversations, people, maybe even friendships. But life has a funny habit of surprising us in quiet moments. Because while Sarah prepared the blood test equipment, another person was about to walk past the open hospital door. A person who would hear part of our conversation. A person who would step into the room for a completely unexpected reason. And that brief, accidental meeting would soon grow into something I never imagined when I first walked into the hospital that morning. A connection, a conversation, and eventually a love story that began in the most unlikely place, right there in an American hospital hallway. But at that moment, I had no idea someone outside the room had just heard my voice and was about to say something that would change everything. When kindness becomes a language. The door to the hospital room was still slightly open. Sarah was preparing the small equipment for the blood test. Dr. Miller was checking a few things on his tablet. The room felt calm again, almost quiet enough to hear the soft hum of the lights above us. And then a voice appeared from the hallway. "Sadi." I didn't mean to interrupt. All three of us turned our heads toward the door. A woman stood there, holding a small stack of papers and a cup of coffee. She wore a simple hospital volunteer badge. Her expression looked slightly embarrassed, like someone who accidentally walked into the middle of a conversation. "I heard you talking about the volunteer program," she said gently. Sarah smiled immediately. "Oh, hi Emily," she said.
"Come in."
Emily stepped into the room carefully, as if she didn't want to disturb anything. "I'm one of the volunteers here," she explained, looking at me with a friendly curiosity. "I was passing by and heard you mention learning English." Now here is something interesting about human interaction. Sometimes the most important conversations in life begin by accident. Not through careful planning, not through big decisions. Just a door slightly open and someone overhearing the right sentence. Emily pulled a chair a little closer to the doorway. "Is it okay if I say hello?" she asked. "Of course," Sarah said. Emily looked at me.
I'm Emily."
Her voice had a calm, friendly rhythm, similar to Sarah's, but with a slightly different tone. Maybe a little softer. "Hello," I replied. Then she asked something that surprised me. Is this your first time in an American hospital? I laughed a little. Yes, and I was a little nervous. She nodded knowingly. That's very normal. Then she added something unexpected. I was nervous the first time too. That sentence caught my attention. You? I asked. Emily smiled. Yes. Even though English is my first language. That sounded confusing. You were nervous speaking English? I asked. She shook her head gently. No. I was nervous about being alone. She leaned back slightly in the chair. You see, hospitals can make anyone feel small, even people who understand every word. That sentence was simple, but powerful. It reminded me that language is not the only thing that makes people feel vulnerable. Being sick, being alone, being far from home, all of these feelings can make even strong people feel fragile. Sarah finished preparing the small needle and said kindly, "This will just take a moment." I nodded and rolled up my sleeve. While she worked carefully, Emily continued the conversation. So, how long have you been in the United States? She asked. About 3 years. And you're learning English through stories? Yes. Her eyes lit up. That's my favorite way to learn anything. Dr. Miller looked up from his tablet. Emily reads a lot, he said with a smile. Emily shrugged playfully. Stories are how humans understand the world. Now here is something scientists have discovered about the brain that makes storytelling so powerful. When we listen to stories, many parts of the brain become active at the same time. Language areas process the words. Emotional areas respond to the feelings. Visual areas imagine the scenes. In other words, stories create a full mental experience. That's why people remember stories much better than isolated information. Emily leaned slightly forward. What kind of stories do you like? She asked. I thought for a moment. Stories about life, about people overcoming difficulties. She nodded slowly. I like those too. Sarah finished the blood test and placed a small bandage on my arm. All done, she said. Thank you, I replied. Emily looked at the small bandage and smiled. See? That wasn't too scary. No, I admitted. Not at all. Then she said something that made the room feel warmer. You know, kindness is a kind of language too. I looked at her curiously. What do you mean? She thought for a moment before answering. Sometimes people worry too much about perfect grammar or perfect vocabulary, she explained. But real communication often happens through tone, patience, and kindness. Sarah nodded in agreement. That's very true. Emily continued. You understood Sarah earlier because she spoke slowly and kindly, not because every sentence was perfect. That observation felt very accurate. In fact, the entire morning had been proof of that idea. Kindness had made communication easier. Kindness had reduced fear. Kindness had opened conversations. Emily looked at the brochure on the table. If you ever want to practice English in a relaxed way, you could visit the volunteer lounge, she suggested. Sometimes we sit together and just talk with patients or visitors. No pressure, Sarah added. Just conversation. That idea sounded surprisingly appealing. A place to talk. A place to listen. A place where imperfect English was welcome. But I still felt a small hesitation. What if my English is too slow? I asked honestly. Emily smiled warmly. Slow conversations are the best conversations. Then she added something unexpected. That's actually how I met one of my closest friends here. Really? I asked. Yes, she said. Was it also through the volunteer program? I asked. Emily's smile changed slightly, becoming softer, almost nostalgic. Yes, she said quietly. Dr. Miller glanced at her and laughed lightly. You're not telling the whole story. Emily shook her head playfully. That's a long story. Now my curiosity was fully awake. I like long stories, I said. Emily looked at me for a moment, then said something that made the atmosphere in the room shift slightly. Well, maybe we can talk about it sometime. She stood up and picked up her coffee cup. I should get back to the volunteer desk, she said. Then she looked back at me one more time. It was nice meeting you. Nice meeting you too, I replied. She walked toward the door, then paused. And in that quiet pause, she asked one more simple question. A question that seemed casual, but would quietly begin the most important chapter of my life in America. Do you live near the hospital? She asked. At the time, it felt like a normal question. But looking back now, that question was the first step towards something much bigger than I could imagine. Because the answer I gave next would lead to another conversation, another meeting, and eventually a relationship that started with kindness inside a hospital room. But in that moment, none of us knew the story that had just quietly begun. Meeting someone special there. Emily paused at the door, still holding her coffee cup, waiting for my answer. Do you live near the hospital? She asked again gently. For a second, I wondered why she was curious. Maybe it was just normal small talk. Maybe she asked everyone that question. I live about 10 minutes away, I replied. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh, that's very close. Then she said something simple. That means you could visit the volunteer lounge sometime. The way she said it didn't feel like pressure. It sounded more like an open door, an invitation without expectations. Dr. Miller glanced at the clock. Well, he said, I think we've finished the medical part for today. He explained that the blood test results would come later, but nothing serious appeared to be happening with my health. Rest more, he advised. Drink water, and try not to work too hard. Then he added with a playful smile, and maybe practice English in comfortable places. Sarah laughed softly. The volunteer lounge is definitely a comfortable place. Emily gave a small wave. I'll be there most afternoons, she said. And then she walked out into the hallway. The door closed quietly behind her. For a moment, the room returned to silence. But my mind felt strangely active. Something about that brief conversation stayed with me. Not because it was dramatic or exciting. It was actually very ordinary. Just a few minutes of talking. But sometimes the smallest conversations create the biggest changes. Psychologists call this something interesting, weak ties. Weak ties are small connections between people who don't know each other well. A short conversation, a friendly greeting, a shared moment. But research shows that weak ties often lead to new opportunities, friendships, and even life-changing events. And although I didn't realize it at the time, that conversation with Emily had just created one of those weak ties. After a few more instructions about rest and medication, I left the hospital room and walked slowly toward the exit. The hallway looked the same as before. Bright lights, quiet footsteps, nurses moving between rooms. but something inside me had changed. Earlier that morning, the hospital felt like a stressful place filled with difficult English. Now it felt human. Conversations had happened.
Kindness had happened.
And maybe, just maybe, a new connection had appeared. Outside the hospital, the air felt fresh and cool. I took a deep breath and started walking home. As I walked, my brain replayed pieces of the morning. Sarah speaking slowly.
Dr.
Miller asking about my life. Emily talking about stories. And one sentence kept returning to my mind. Kindness is a language too. That idea stayed with me for the rest of the day. Later that evening, while sitting at my small kitchen table, I opened my English notebook. Usually I practiced vocabulary or grammar exercises. But that night, I did something different. I wrote down the conversations from the hospital. Hello. How can I help you today? How long have you been feeling this way? Communication is not about perfect English. Reading those sentences again, I noticed something interesting. None of them were complicated. In fact, most of them used very simple words. But they felt meaningful because they were connected to real experiences. That's another secret about language learning that many textbooks forget to explain. Words become powerful when they belong to a story. When a word is connected to a real moment, your brain remembers it more easily. And suddenly I realized something. That hospital visit had been one of the best English lessons I had experienced since arriving in the United States. Not because someone was teaching me grammar, but because I was living inside a story. A real story. With real people. The next afternoon, I found myself thinking about the volunteer lounge again. Emily had said she would be there. Of course, visiting the hospital again felt a little strange. I was no longer a patient, but the idea of relaxed conversations, simple English, and human connection felt appealing. Still, another voice in my head whispered something familiar. What if your English is too slow? What if you don't know what to say? That voice is very common among language learners. It's the quiet voice of self-doubt. But another thought appeared. Sarah had spoken slowly.
Dr.
Miller had listened patiently. Emily had said slow conversations were the best conversations. Maybe, just maybe, it was safe to try. So the next day, around 3 in the afternoon, I walked toward the hospital again. The same building. The same glass doors. But this time I wasn't nervous about my health. I was curious about something else. Conversation. When I entered the building, I asked the receptionist where the volunteer lounge was located. She pointed down a quiet hallway. Second door on the left. My heart beat a little faster as I walked down the corridor. What would happen inside that room? Would there be many people? Would the conversation feel awkward? Would Emily even remember me? I reached the door and hesitated for 1 second. Then I knocked gently. A voice from inside said, "Come in." I opened the door slowly. Inside the room were 3 chairs, a small table, and a few bookshelves filled with magazines and novels. And sitting near the window was Emily. She looked up, surprised for half a second. Then her face lit up with a warm smile. "Well," she said softly, "I was wondering if you might come." But what happened in that volunteer lounge over the next few weeks would slowly turn simple English conversations into something much deeper. Something unexpected. Because those slow, friendly conversations would eventually lead to laughter, long walks, shared stories, and the beginning of a relationship neither of us planned. A relationship that started with kindness in a hospital hallway. But the first real conversation in that lounge would reveal something about Emily's life that surprised me completely. And once she began telling that story, everything between us started to change. Learning English through love. Emily looked up from the book she was holding when I stepped into the volunteer lounge. For a moment, she seemed surprised. Maybe she didn't actually expect me to come back. Then her face brightened with a warm smile that felt genuine, not polite. "Well," she said softly, closing the book, "I was wondering if you might come." I laughed a little, suddenly feeling less nervous. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "Why not?" she asked. "Because my English is slow," I said honestly. Emily leaned back slightly in the chair and laughed, not in a mocking way, but in the way someone laughs when they hear something familiar. "Slow English is perfect here," she said. She gestured toward the empty chair across from her. "Sit down." The volunteer lounge was quiet. Sunlight came through the large window beside us, touching the wooden table and the bookshelves filled with magazines and novels. It didn't feel like a hospital room at all. It felt more like a peaceful reading corner in a library. Emily placed her coffee cup on the table. "So," she said with curiosity, "how is your day today?" The question sounded simple, but something about the way she asked made it feel important. "Better," I replied. "The doctor said I just need rest." "That's good news." For a moment, we both looked out the window. A few people were walking across the hospital parking lot, moving slowly under the afternoon sun. Then Emily turned back toward me. "Do you know something interesting about language learning?" she asked. "What?" I said. "People learn faster when they talk about things that matter to them." That idea sounded simple, but it made a lot of sense. Think about it. When people talk about weather or small talk, the brain stays calm, but not very excited. But when people talk about their lives, their memories, their dreams, something different happens. The brain becomes emotionally involved. And emotional involvement helps memory. Researchers in neuroscience have found that emotional experiences activate the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for forming long-term memories. In simple words, feelings help learning stick. Emily tapped the book she had been reading. "That's why stories work so well," she said. "What story were you reading?" I asked. She turned the book toward me. It was a collection of short life stories written by different people. "Some volunteers read these stories with patience," she explained. "It helps them relax." She paused, then added playfully, "But today we can create our own story." "Our own story?" I repeated. "Sure," she said with a smile. "Conversation is just a story happening in real time." I liked that idea. And somehow, that simple sentence made speaking English feel less like a test and more like sharing. So we started talking. At first, the conversation moved slowly. Very slowly. Sometimes I paused to find the right word. Sometimes Emily helped me finish a sentence when I got stuck. But she never rushed me. And that patience created something powerful. Confidence. That's another interesting truth about language learning. Confidence is not something you suddenly gain after mastering grammar. Confidence grows through safe conversations. One good conversation can remove weeks of fear. Emily asked about my childhood, my family, my reasons for coming to America. And I asked about her life too. "Why did you become a volunteer?" I asked. She thought about the question for a moment. My mother spent a long time in hospitals when I was younger, she said quietly. Her voice changed slightly, becoming softer. She was very sick for several years. I listened carefully. And one day, she continued, a volunteer sat with her and talked for almost an hour. It was the first time I saw my mother laugh in weeks. She smiled faintly at the memory. That moment stayed with me. So now you volunteer, I said. Yes, she nodded. Because kindness can travel in circles. That sentence stayed in my mind. Kindness can travel in circles. The conversation continued, flowing more easily now. Minutes became an hour. And something interesting happened. Without noticing, my English started moving more naturally. Not perfect, but smoother. Because the focus was no longer on grammar. The focus was on connection. Emily noticed it too. You're speaking faster now, she said with a playful smile. Really? I asked. Yes. And you're thinking less. She pointed gently toward my head. That's the secret. Many language teachers explain this idea using a simple metaphor. Learning a language is like learning to ride a bicycle. At first, you think about every movement, balance, pedaling, steering. But once your brain trusts the process, the movements become automatic. Conversation works the same way. When fear disappears, language flows. As the afternoon sun began to lower outside the window, our conversation moved to lighter topics, favorite foods, movies, places we wanted to visit someday. And occasionally we laughed. That laughter was important. Because laughter builds something psychologists call social bonding, the feeling that two people are comfortable with each other. And comfort creates trust. When the clock on the wall showed nearly 5 o'clock, Emily stood up slowly. I should finish my volunteer shift, she said. I nodded. Thank you for talking with me. She smiled warmly. Thank you for coming. Then she added something unexpected. You know, learning English through stories is good. But learning English through friendship is even better. That sentence stayed with me long after I left the hospital that day. Over the next few weeks, I returned to the volunteer lounge many times. Sometimes we talked about books. Sometimes about culture. Sometimes about life in America. And each conversation felt easier than the last. But somewhere in the middle of those quiet afternoons, something subtle began to change. Our conversations became longer. Our laughter became easier. And the way we looked at each other started to carry a small curiosity, something more than simple friendship. Neither of us said anything about it at first. But one evening, after a long walk outside the hospital building, Emily asked a question that made my heart beat a little faster. A question that moved our story in a completely new direction. Do you ever miss home? She asked softly. And the answer to that question would slowly open the door to something neither of us expected. Because sometimes the person who helps you learn a language also becomes the person who changes your life. Building a life in America together. Do you ever miss home? Emily's question came gently, almost like a quiet breeze at the end of a long day. We were walking slowly outside the hospital building. The sun was already low, painting the sky with soft orange light. Cars moved calmly through the parking lot, and the evening air felt cooler than the warm afternoon inside the volunteer lounge. I thought about her question carefully. Yes, I said finally. Sometimes very much. Emily nodded as if she expected that answer. What do you miss the most? She asked. That question was harder, because missing home is not just about one thing. It's a collection of small memories. I miss my family, I said. And small things: food, language, the feeling of understanding everything around me. Emily smiled gently. That makes sense. She kicked a small stone on the sidewalk as we walked. Moving to a different country is like learning to breathe in a different rhythm. That sentence made me pause. A different rhythm? Yes, she said. Different culture, different habits, different ways people talk and think. She looked at me curiously. What was the biggest surprise for you when you came to America? That question made me laugh. There were many surprises. Tell me one, she said. I thought for a moment. In my country, people often visit family very often, I explained. Sometimes several times each week. Emily raised her eyebrows slightly. That sounds nice. In America, people seem more independent, I continued. Everyone is busy with their own schedule. She nodded slowly. That's true. Independence is a big part of American culture. Cultural differences can feel confusing at first. Sociologists often describe culture as an invisible set of rules that guide how people behave, how they communicate, how they show respect, even how they express love. When you grow up inside one culture, those rules feel natural. But when you move to another country, suddenly the rules change. And learning those new rules takes time. Emily seemed interested in hearing more. What else felt different? She asked. The way people communicate, I said. How so? In my culture, people sometimes speak indirectly, I explained. But in America, people often say things very directly. Emily laughed. Yes, Americans are famous for that. But I think I like it, I added. Why? Because it is easier to understand. She smiled. That's a good way to see it. We reached the end of the hospital parking lot and turned toward a small walking path beside the building. Trees lined the path, and the evening air smelled faintly of grass and rain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emily asked another thoughtful question. What do you hope for in the future here? That question felt important, not just small talk. Future questions often reveal what people truly care about. I want to build a stable life, I said slowly. Work, improve my English, maybe start a family someday. Emily looked ahead quietly. A family, she repeated. Yes. Then I asked something I had been wondering about. What about you? She smiled slightly, but didn't answer immediately. Life doesn't always go exactly as we plan, she said. That's true everywhere, I replied. She nodded. Now I think life is more like a story, she said thoughtfully. A story? Yes. Some chapters are planned. Others appear unexpectedly. Her words reminded me of the day we first met. An unexpected conversation in a hospital hallway. A volunteer lounge. A simple friendship slowly growing through conversation. The sky was becoming darker now, and small lights along the path began to glow. Emily stopped walking and looked at me. You know something interesting? She said. What? You're much more comfortable speaking English now than the first day we met. I laughed. Maybe a little. It's not just vocabulary, she said. Your confidence changed. She was right. Confidence had grown quietly during our conversations. Psychologists often describe confidence as a product of repeated safe experiences. When people speak a new language in environments where mistakes are accepted, the brain gradually removes its fear response. Fear decreases. Fluency increases. Emily crossed her arms lightly. And I think something else helped too.
What?
Real conversations. She pointed toward the hospital building behind us. Language textbooks teach grammar, but life teaches communication. I liked that sentence. Life teaches communication. The hospital had become more than just a place for medical care. It had become the starting point for new experiences, new conversations, new understanding, and slowly a new connection between two people from different backgrounds. Emily looked at the sky again. You know, she said, when people from different cultures build a life together, they create something unique. Unique how? I asked. They combine two worlds. That idea felt beautiful. Two worlds, two cultures, two stories, all slowly blending together. But there was still something neither of us had said out loud yet. The quiet possibility that our friendship might be turning into something deeper. Sometimes feelings grow quietly before people are brave enough to speak about them. And on that peaceful evening walk, something in the air felt different. Emily hesitated for a moment, then asked a question that made my heart beat faster again. A question that moved our story one step closer to a new chapter. Can I ask you something a little personal? She said. Of course. She took a small breath. Do you believe people from very different cultures can build a happy life together? The question sounded simple, but behind it was something much bigger. Because the answer to that question would shape the future of both our lives. And the way I responded that evening would slowly lead our story toward a decision neither of us expected when we first met in that hospital room. A decision about love, about culture, and about building a life together in America. Marriage, family, and new dreams. Do you believe people from very different cultures can build a happy life together? Emily's question floated quietly in the cool evening air. For a moment, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have an opinion, but because I understood that this was not just a theoretical question. It wasn't about culture in general. It was about us. The path beside the hospital had grown darker now, with only a few soft lights guiding the way. Cars passed slowly in the distance, and somewhere nearby a door closed with a gentle echo. I looked at Emily. I think they can, I said carefully. But it's not always easy. She nodded slowly, as if she already knew that answer. Why do you think it's difficult? She asked. Because culture shapes many small things in life. I explained. How people communicate, how they solve problems, even how they show love. Emily smiled softly. That's very true. She leaned against the railing beside the path. You know, I've been thinking about something too. What? I asked. About how strange it is that we met in a hospital. I laughed quietly. Yes, that was unexpected. She tilted her head playfully. Imagine explaining that story to people. How did you meet? In a hospital room while talking about English. We both laughed. But after the laughter faded, a quiet moment returned. Sometimes silence between two people is uncomfortable, but sometimes silence means something else. Comfort. Trust. Emily looked at me thoughtfully. You've changed a lot since the first day, she said. How? You were nervous about speaking English, she explained. Now you speak with confidence. I shrugged. Maybe I just had good teachers. She smiled. I don't think I taught you English. You taught me something more important, I said.
What?
That communication is about connection, not perfection. She seemed touched by that answer. Psychologists often say that strong relationships grow through shared experiences and emotional support. When people help each other overcome challenges, their bond becomes deeper. And in a strange way, that's what had been happening between us. Emily helped me feel comfortable speaking English, and our conversations slowly built trust. She looked down at the path for a moment. Can I tell you something honest? She asked. Of course. I enjoy our conversations more than I expected, she said. That sentence was simple, but it carried a quiet meaning. I enjoy them too, I replied. She took a slow breath. Sometimes I wonder where this story is going. There it was. The unspoken question. Not just about language. Not just about friendship. About something more. I thought carefully before speaking. In my culture, I said slowly, relationships often grow slowly. People spend time understanding each other before making big decisions. Emily nodded. That sounds wise. In America, things sometimes move faster, she added. That can be true, I said. She laughed lightly. But I don't want to rush anything. Neither do I. For a moment, we simply stood there together under the quiet evening sky. Then Emily said something that surprised me. You mentioned earlier that you hope to build a family someday. Yes. She looked at me directly. I want that too. That moment felt important. Not dramatic. Not loud. But meaningful. When two people share similar hopes for the future, something powerful happens. Psychologists call this shared life vision, the idea that two individuals imagine a similar future together. Research shows that couples with shared values and goals often build stronger relationships. And standing there beside the hospital path, it suddenly felt like our stories might be moving in the same direction. Emily pushed a small strand of hair behind her ear. My parents always told me something interesting, she said.
What?
They said marriage is not just about love. It's about partnership. Partnership, I repeated. Yes, she said. Two people supporting each other while building a life. That idea felt very meaningful, especially for someone living far from home. Building a life in a new country is not easy. It requires patience, resilience, and often a lot of emotional strength. But sharing that journey with another person can make it feel less heavy. Emily looked back toward the hospital building. You know, she said softly, that place changed more than your English. How so? It brought two strangers together. That sentence felt simple, yet deeply true. If I had never walked into that hospital that morning, if Sarah had not spoken kindly, if Emily had not walked past the door, none of this would have happened. Life is full of invisible crossroads, small moments that quietly change the direction of our lives. Emily looked at me again. Can I ask you one more question? She said. Sure. Her voice became slightly softer. If our story keeps going, where do you see it leading? The question felt important, not just about the present, about the future. I looked up at the night sky for a moment before answering. Maybe toward building a life together, I said honestly. She didn't answer immediately. But the smile that slowly appeared on her face told me everything I needed to know. Yet even though that evening felt like a beginning, neither of us knew how many challenges were still ahead. Cultural differences. Family expectations. The long process of building stability in a new country. Real relationships are not perfect stories. They're journeys with obstacles. And the next chapter of our story would test whether kindness, patience, and love were strong enough to overcome those challenges. Because building a life together in America would soon require one of the biggest decisions we had ever made. A decision about commitment, about family, and about whether two people from different worlds were truly ready to walk the same path. How English slowly became my voice. That evening beside the hospital path stayed in my mind for a long time, not because something dramatic happened. There were no fireworks, no sudden confessions like in movies. Instead, something quieter happened, something more real. Two people simply realized that their lives might be moving in the same direction. But life rarely moves forward in a straight line. Over the next months, Emily and I continued meeting regularly. Sometimes at the hospital volunteer lounge, sometimes at a small cafe down the street, and sometimes walking through the quiet park nearby. At first, our conversations still moved slowly, very slowly. There were moments when I paused in the middle of a sentence, searching for the right English word. Sometimes I used simple vocabulary to explain complicated thoughts. But something interesting was happening at the same time. The language that once felt like a barrier was slowly becoming a bridge. Psychologists who study language learning often describe a stage called language ownership. It's the moment when a learner stops feeling like they are borrowing the language and begins feeling like the language belongs to them. Not perfectly, but personally. And I could feel that change happening little by little. Emily noticed it too. One afternoon, while we were sitting in the cafe near the hospital, she said something that surprised me. "You tell stories differently now." "Differently?" I asked. "Yes," she said, stirring her coffee slowly. "When we first met, you spoke like someone translating your thoughts." I laughed. "That's exactly what I was doing. But now," she continued, "you speak like someone thinking directly in English." That observation made me pause. Thinking directly in English. That is a major turning point for many language learners. At the beginning, most learners translate everything from their native language. Native language English. But as the brain becomes more comfortable with a new language, something fascinating happens. The brain begins forming direct connections between ideas and English words. No translation required. Linguists call this automatic processing. And it changes everything. Because once language becomes automatic, communication becomes natural. I looked at Emily and smiled. Maybe that's because I've been practicing with the best conversation partner. She laughed. "I think we've both been practicing."
How? Listening, she said.
Listening. That word may sound simple, but it carries enormous power in relationships. Communication experts often say that listening is the most underrated skill in human interaction. Many people focus on speaking well, but true connection often comes from listening carefully. And Emily was an excellent listener. When I talked about my work, she listened. When I talked about missing my family, she listened. When I talked about my hopes for the future, she listened. And that kind of listening gave me the confidence to express more of myself. Over time, Our conversations moved beyond simple topics. We talked about culture, about differences between our childhood experiences, about our ideas of family, responsibility, and happiness. Sometimes we even disagreed. But those disagreements were important, because healthy relationships are not about always agreeing. They are about understanding different perspectives. Emily once said something that stayed with me. Two cultures don't cancel each other, she explained. They create something new. That idea felt very true. Our relationship was slowly becoming a combination of two worlds, two traditions, two ways of thinking. And somewhere inside that combination, we were building something unique. During those months, my English continued improving in ways I never expected. Not through grammar books, not through vocabulary lists, but through real life, real conversations, real emotions, real experiences. Language learning research actually supports this idea. Studies show that people who use a new language in meaningful relationships often develop deeper fluency than those who study only through formal lessons, because emotions strengthen memory, and relationships create emotional experiences every day. One evening, after we finished dinner at a small restaurant near the park, Emily looked at me thoughtfully. You know something interesting?
She said.
What? The hospital visit that made you nervous ended up changing your entire life. She was right. That one morning had led to conversations. Those conversations led to friendship, and that friendship was slowly becoming something deeper. But life was about to introduce another important chapter. Because building a relationship is one thing, building a family is another. And soon, Emily and I would have to think seriously about the future. Not just about love, but about responsibility, about commitment, about creating a home together. Those questions would lead us toward one of the most important decisions of our lives. A decision that involved more than just two people. It involved families, cultures, and the dream of building a life that honored both. But before that decision could happen, something unexpected would bring us back to the very place where our story first began. The hospital. Only this time, the reason for returning there would be completely different. And when we walked through those hospital doors again, it would mark the beginning of a new chapter. One that would change not only our lives, but the life of someone else who had not even been born yet. A happy ending and a simple truth. Life has a strange sense of humor. Sometimes the place that once made you nervous becomes the place where your most beautiful memories begin. Almost a year after the day I first walked into that American hospital, worried about my health and even more worried about my English, Emily and I were standing in front of the same building again. But this time, everything felt different. The same glass doors, the same quiet hallway, the same reception desk. Yet the feeling inside my chest was not fear. It was anticipation. Emily stood beside me, holding my hand gently. Her eyes were bright, and her smile carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "You ready?" she asked softly. I laughed a little. "I think so." You see, we were not returning to the hospital for illness. We were returning because our lives were about to change in the most wonderful way. Emily was going to give birth to our first child. And suddenly, that hospital, the place where our story quietly began, was becoming the place where a new chapter would start. As we walked down the familiar hallway, I noticed something that made me smile. The volunteer lounge door was still there. The same room where our conversations had slowly grown from awkward English practice into long, meaningful talks about life, culture, and dreams. Emily noticed me looking at the door. "You're thinking about the first day, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes." She squeezed my hand. That day changed everything. She was right. That first hospital visit had felt like a small moment in life. But small moments sometimes create the biggest changes. Psychologists often talk about turning points, moments that shift the direction of a person's life in unexpected ways. These moments are rarely dramatic at the time they happen. They feel ordinary. A conversation, a meeting, a simple act of kindness. But later, when we look back, we realize that those moments were actually the beginning of something much bigger. Sarah, the nurse who had spoken slowly and patiently with me, was working that day too. When she saw us walking down the hallway, her face lit up with surprise. "Hey," she said. "I know you too." Emily laughed. "Yes, you do." Sarah looked at Emily's stomach and then back at me. "Well, this is wonderful news."
Dr.
Miller passed by a few minutes later and recognized us immediately. "Look at that," he said with a grin. One hospital visit turned into a whole family. We all laughed, but his words carried a simple truth. Life sometimes grows in ways we never expect. A nervous patient, a kind nurse, a volunteer passing by an open door, a conversation about stories, and suddenly a life together. Later that evening, as Emily rested and the nurses prepared the room, I sat quietly by the window. The city lights outside looked soft and peaceful, and my mind traveled back through the journey. The fear I felt about speaking English, the hesitation before every sentence, the feeling that the language would always be something difficult, something separate from me. But somewhere along the way, something changed. English stopped being just a subject to study. It became a voice. My voice. Language learning experts often say that the true goal of learning a language is not perfection. It is expression. The ability to share your thoughts, your feelings, your story. And sitting there in that hospital room, I realized something simple but powerful. The language that once made me nervous had helped me build a life. It helped me explain my symptoms to a nurse. It helped me share stories with Emily. It helped me understand a new culture. And it helped two people from different worlds build a family together. Later that night, a nurse entered the room with a warm smile. "It's time," she said gently. A few hours later, I was holding the smallest and most beautiful person I had ever seen. Our child. Emily looked tired but happy. "Can you believe this?" she whispered. I shook my head slowly. Not really. The room was quiet except for the soft breathing of the baby. And in that peaceful moment, I thought about the lesson hidden inside our story. Many people feel discouraged when learning a new language. They feel slow. They feel embarrassed about mistakes. They feel like giving up. But language learning is not just about grammar or vocabulary. It is about connection. It is about courage. It is about being willing to speak even when your sentences are imperfect. Because sometimes the simple act of trying to communicate opens doors you never imagined. Doors to friendships. Doors to opportunities. And sometimes doors to love. If I had been too afraid to speak that morning in the hospital, our story might never have begun. But one slow conversation changed everything. So if you are learning English right now and sometimes feel tired or frustrated, remember this. Every sentence you speak is a step. Every conversation is part of your story. And one day, you may look back and realize that the language you struggled with quietly helped shape the life you built. Sometimes the smallest conversations create the biggest journeys. And sometimes, the place where you felt most uncertain becomes the place where your happiest story begins. Before you leave, think about this for a moment. What if the one English sentence you are afraid to speak today becomes the sentence that changes your life tomorrow? In this channel, every story is more than a story. It's a way to help you learn real English through emotions, real conversations, and unforgettable moments. Step by step, your listening will improve, your confidence will grow, and one day you may realize that English is no longer a barrier, but your voice to the world. So if you enjoy learning English through powerful stories, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story that might inspire you even more. And here's something exciting. In the next video, you'll discover a new emotional story about love, courage, and a life-changing decision in America, a story that might make you see English learning in a completely different way. Stay curious. Keep listening.
Keep speaking.
Because sometimes, one simple conversation can change an entire life.